In September 2006, something chilling was discovered at John's Sports Park in Douglas, Georgia. Nearly 2 decades would pass before the case saw a breakthrough. Doris Worrell was born on September 18, 1967, in Fort Valley, Georgia. As a young woman, she married John Worrell, and together they built a life filled with love, family, and ambition. They had children and worked hard to provide a stable home. Doris had worn many hats. She had worked as a teacher and an interior designer, before dedicating herself fully to motherhood. She and John also ran a business together, a recreation center called John's Sports Park in Douglas. On the morning of September 20, 2006, John briefly left the sports park for what seemed like a routine errand. When he returned around 11:15 a.m., he found his wife lifeless on the floor. Doris, only 39 years old, had been fatally shot. Shaken, John immediately called 911. Officers from the Coffee County Sheriff's Office arrived around 11:17 a.m. and launched an investigation that soon began to unravel a far more complex story. John told investigators he had left around 9:40 a.m. and returned to discover the tragedy. The initial assumption was a robbery gone wrong, and 2 employees were arrested on conspiracy charges. However, due to a lack of evidence, those charges were later dropped, leaving the case wide open. As detectives dug deeper, troubling details began to surface. It was revealed that John had been having an inappropriate relationship with the couple's 18-year-old live-in nanny Paula Yobbery. At the time, John and Doris were reportedly experiencing serious marital problems, and it was suspected that John feared losing custody of their children if a divorce occurred. John's actions after Doris's death raised even more red flags. He traveled first to Fernandina Beach, Florida, and later fled to Costa Rica. Paula, meanwhile, was detained and eventually deported due to her undocumented status. Despite this, sightings of her and John together in Costa Rica continued. They denied being in a relationship, but multiple reports suggested they were raising Doris's children as their own. As suspicions mounted and public support faded, John's behavior grew increasingly evasive. Eventually he vanished, and with little solid evidence, the case went cold. In April 2025, nearly 19 years later, a major development emerged. John and Paula had reportedly ended their relationship. This new dynamic gave investigators a rare chance. Agents from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation traveled to Costa Rica and approached Paola, hoping she would cooperate. She agreed to speak, and her testimony, combined with old evidence and newly confirmed facts, provided the long-awaited breakthrough. Authorities obtained arrest warrants for John, and on May 20, 2025, he was arrested in Mayfield, Missouri. He waived extradition and was transported back to Georgia, where he was booked into the Coffee County Jail without bond. The charges reflected the gravity of the crime, arranging for someone to end his wife's life. In a public statement, the Coffee County Sheriff emphasized the department's dedication to the case. He said the case was never forgotten, and though the road to justice was long and often frustrating, they never gave up. Justice delayed is still justice, and in this case, it finally arrived. The arrest of John Worrell brought long-awaited relief to Doris's loved ones. Leanne Tuggle, Doris's older sister, spoke publicly following the news. Her words were filled with pain and love as she reflected on the loss. Sometimes she was too kind for her own good, she said. Her being kind is ultimately what caused her end. Doris's former classmate, Lisa Hayes, also shared her thoughts. She believed the arrest was just the beginning of true justice. The closure will come when the verdict is read, she said. The agents always said they wouldn't make an arrest unless they had enough for a conviction. The conviction we want to see is that John Worrell is guilty of ending the life of his wife. John was denied bond during his first court appearance. Investigators are still working to confirm who exactly pulled the trigger. One of the 2 men originally charged 17 years ago has since passed away, while the other was recently released from prison after serving time for a separate crime. Paula Yobbery, the former nanny, has not been charged. The arrest cannot undo the heartbreak or bring Doris back, but for her family, it signals the beginning of long overdue accountability. On March 17, 2010, a quiet day at a family-run furniture store in Dothan, Alabama, turned into a devastating tragedy. Despite ongoing efforts by law enforcement, the case would remain cold for years, kept alive only by the unrelenting hope of those who loved the woman at its center. Grace Ann Bridges Dedert was born on June 27, 1940. She built a life in Dothan with her husband Don Dedert, and together they raised 4 children. Grace had a giving spirit and worked for many years as a nurse, caring for others with quiet strength and compassion. Even at age 69, she remained active, managing Dedert's new and used furniture, the family's store at 966 South Park Avenue. That day began like any other. Grace opened the store, ready for a normal day of work. But at some point, an unknown individual entered the store, shot her, and left undetected, taking only a small amount of cash. It wasn't until a customer arrived later that the horrifying scene was discovered. Authorities were called immediately, but by the time they arrived, Grace was already gone. She had been shot once in the abdomen and likely attempted to call for help in her final moments. Evidence indicated she had tried to reach for the phone and dial 911 before losing consciousness. The investigators initially believed it was a robbery gone wrong. There were no signs of forced entry, and only money was missing. Officers began canvassing the area, interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something, but few leads emerged. Witnesses, if there were any, had little to offer. The store lacked security cameras, and the suspect had left no trace behind. The case stalled. Years went by, but the pain remained, and the questions never faded. The scene was carefully examined, but no immediate breakthroughs followed. As time went on, leads dried up, and the case grew colder. With no arrests made and no new evidence surfacing, the investigation eventually stalled. Years later, the police department made the decision to reopen the case. Detectives revisited old files, interviewed previous witnesses, and utilized advanced forensic tools that hadn't been available during the original investigation. This renewed effort led them to identify a new suspect, Shanquise Franklin. At the time of the crime, in 2010, Franklin had been just 17 years old. In the years since, he had served a 5-year prison sentence for unrelated charges, including obstruction of justice, theft, and substance-related offenses. His prior record drew the attention of investigators, and as the case was re-examined, connections began to emerge linking him to the crime. On April 9, 2025, the Houston County Grand Jury returned an indictment against Franklin. That same day, he was taken into custody and booked into the Houston County Jail. Because Franklin was a juvenile when the crime occurred, Alabama's juvenile privacy laws limit the information that can be publicly released. As he awaits trial, the indictment stands as a significant turning point in a case that had remained unsolved for 15 years. Law enforcement's persistence and refusal to let Grace's story be forgotten were finally beginning to yield results. Grace's daughter, Wendy Northington, reflected on the kind of person her mother had been. To us, that was who she was. Amazing, she was amazing, Grace, Wendy said. She was a registered nurse and was a caregiver. She saved many lives. She was just our best friend, our mentor. We just loved everything about her. In August 1984, a 17-year-old girl disappeared after a night out in Calais, Maine. Her name was Linda Maxwell. For decades, her family lived under the weight of not knowing what had happened, with questions that went unanswered for more than 40 years. Linda had been born on February 19, 1966, in the quiet town of Calais. On August 23, 1984, she went out with friends but never came home. Her family immediately sensed something was wrong. It was unlike Linda to stay out of touch, and within hours a missing person report was filed. Police launched a search without delay, retracing her steps and questioning everyone who might have been with her that night. 2 days later, on August 25th, the search ended in heartbreak. Linda's body was discovered along the riverbank in Robinson, Maine, not far from her hometown. With the recovery of her remains, the case shifted from a missing person report to a suspicious death investigation. Law enforcement worked to piece together Linda's final hours, questioning witnesses and reviewing every clue they could find. At the time, the official cause of death was listed as drowning, but doubts remained. Linda had been a strong swimmer, comfortable in the water, and unlikely to have drowned accidentally. Even more troubling were the unexplained bruises found on her body. Friends and family never accepted the explanation, and over time, as leads dwindled, the case went cold. Then, unexpectedly, the silence broke. On May 1, 2025, 65-year-old Raymond Brown of Bangor, Maine, was arrested. A Washington County grand jury indicted him on charges related to Linda's death. Brown pleaded not guilty and is being held without bail. His arrest marked a dramatic development in a case that had haunted the town for over 4 decades. Authorities have not publicly disclosed the evidence that led to Brown's indictment, but advances in forensic science and the relentless efforts of cold case investigators are believed to have played a vital role. Linda's story, long buried under time and uncertainty, was finally being brought into the light in the days that followed. The town of Calais reflected on the painful chapter of its history. Emotions ran deep as residents revisited memories of Linda and the mystery that had lingered for generations, while the pain of her loss remains. The arrest offered a glimmer of long-awaited accountability and a reminder that justice, no matter how delayed, is never out of reach. The emotions were palpable not just for Linda Maxwell, but for the decades of unanswered questions that had haunted her loved ones. The arrest stirred deep memories among those who had grown up with her. They recalled her laughter, her spirit, and the abrupt, painful silence that followed her disappearance. For others who were younger at the time or had since left the area, the news brought shock and disbelief. Some had faint memories of the man now accused. Others were stunned to learn his identity. The idea that the alleged perpetrator had lived undetected among them for so long was deeply unsettling. Raymond Brown remains in custody, formally indicted and awaiting trial. Prosecutors are building a case that centers around newly uncovered forensic evidence, along with testimonies from both original and recently identified witnesses. Brown's criminal record may also influence the court's view of the case. If convicted, he faces a potential life sentence. For Linda's family and the community of Calais, the road to justice, though long now, feels within reach. In December 2003, a man walking his dog in Washington State made a horrifying discovery that would open a difficult and heartbreaking investigation. The journey toward justice would be long, tangled in years of silence, cold leads, and legal dead ends. Tamara Morris Matson, known to many as Tammy, was born in 1964 and spent much of her adult life in Washington, especially in Snohomish, northern King County. She moved frequently between towns such as Everett, Marysville, Lake Stevens, and Kirkland. A mother to 7 children, Tamara faced more than her share of challenges. But she worked hard to keep her family together. By 1999, however, her circumstances began to unravel. After she was absent for several days, authorities intervened. Her children were placed into foster care, and custody was eventually granted to their grandmother. This separation marked a painful turning point. From that moment on, Tamara lost contact with her children, and the once strong bonds of family slowly eroded. The reasons for her absence remained unclear, but what was evident was that Tamara was struggling. Life had become increasingly difficult. The loss of her children only deepened her distress, leaving her further isolated. Without a strong support system, Tamara was left to navigate a harsh world on her own. Each day became a matter of survival. She may have dreamed of reuniting with her children or finding a path back to stability, but her reality was filled with uncertainty. What she didn't know was that she was heading toward an even darker fate. On December 9, 2003, a man walking his dog near the entrance of Camano Island State Park came upon a shocking scene. Just off a trail by the packing area on Elgar Bay Road, he found a woman's body concealed in the thick underbrush. Alarmed, he contacted authorities immediately. Police responded quickly, securing the area and launching a full investigation. Forensic teams began collecting evidence from the secluded site. The victim was soon identified as Tamara Matson. The discovery of her body in such a remote and quiet place raised immediate suspicions. As investigators combed through the area, they found a cigarette butt near the parking lot, an item that would become a critical piece of evidence in the years to come. Though it seemed like a minor clue, the cigarette butt was carefully collected and preserved by responding officers. At the time, DNA testing had its limitations, and the sample couldn't be fully analyzed. That changed in 2009, 6 years after Tamara's death, when advancements in forensic science allowed the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab to revisit the evidence. With the improved capabilities of DNA profiling, experts were able to extract a genetic profile from the small trace of biological material left on the cigarette. The DNA was entered into the combined DNA index system CODIS, and it generated a match to a man serving time in prison in Arizona called Schlabum. Up until that point, Schlabum had never been linked to the case. His name had not surfaced during the original investigation. The DNA match was a major breakthrough, finally giving detectives a suspect to pursue. However, while the DNA confirmed that Schlabum had been at the park, it didn't prove when he was there or what involvement, if any, he had in Tamara's death. This presented a major challenge. The presence of his DNA in the vicinity could mean he had passed through the area at a different time and was not necessarily connected to the crime. Without direct evidence placing him at the scene during the time of Tamara's death, authorities lacked the certainty needed to move forward with charges. In the years that followed, investigators worked tirelessly to close the gap between suspicion and proof. They examined every lead, no matter how minor. They reviewed Schlabum's criminal history, traced his movements, and searched for any possible link to Tamara. But the case remained cold, and more than 2 decades passed without resolution. In 2019, detectives made another push. They traveled to the Arizona prison where Schlabum was serving his sentence and requested an interview. Schlabum refused to speak. The investigation stalled again. Then, just months later, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, bringing a new wave of delays. Travel restrictions, limited communication, and health precautions made it difficult for agencies to collaborate, putting the case on hold once again. Then, in April 2021, an unexpected development reignited hope. Schlabum sent a letter to Island County detectives claiming he had information about Tamara Matson's death. Along with his letter, he included a list of demands, chief among them a request to serve any future sentence in Washington State instead of returning to Arizona. The detective reviewing the letter agreed to consider only one of the demands: the possibility of transferring Schlabum to a Washington facility if and only if he confessed to the crime and entered a guilty plea. Under these terms, the detectives arranged a free talk, a type of interview where the suspect is temporarily granted immunity to speak openly without immediate legal consequences. During this interview, Schlabum revealed information about the case that had never been made public. According to investigators, he described details that only someone directly involved could have known. The content of his confession convinced detectives that they finally had the truth. Schlabum filled in key gaps in the timeline and revealed that the motive behind Tamara's death stemmed from a dispute related to a substance deal. His account aligned with previously unconfirmed theories and gave detectives the clarity they had long sought. Convinced that they had finally identified Tamara's killer, detectives began drafting an agreement. Schlabum would provide a sworn confession after his transfer from Arizona to Washington was approved. In exchange, he would face formal charges in Island County for first-degree premeditated murder and first-degree kidnapping. However, the agreement fell apart. The detective was unable to secure a permanent placement for Schlabum in a Washington prison. Without that assurance, Schlabum refused to sign the confession, and without his signed statement, there wasn't enough legal evidence to formally charge him. The investigation stalled again. 3 more years passed. In 2024, detectives made another effort to reach out to Schlabum, hoping to reopen negotiations. But this time, there was no response. In October of that year, a family member contacted authorities and shared devastating news. Schlabum had suffered multiple strokes and was now living with advanced dementia. She explained that he likely could not even understand the letters being sent to him. 2 months later, Arizona corrections officials confirmed the diagnosis. Schlabum was now housed in a special needs unit, requiring around-the-clock care. Though it was deeply disappointing not to secure a formal conviction or legal confession, investigators acknowledged a small sense of closure. They believed that identified the person responsible for Tamara's death. Even if he would never stand trial or face sentencing for her killing, Schlabum would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. In January 2025, the case was officially closed. For Tamara's family, it wasn't the justice they had hoped for, but it was a step toward long-awaited answers. Her aunt, Deborah Darling, spoke openly about the emotional toll. "Today has just kind of opened up an old wound," she said. "I am glad that it is finally over. I am thankful that finally we know for sure, but I always knew and her mother always knew it was Carl." She recalled her years of persistence. "I called and I called," she said. "I would have conversations, and they would explain to me that they didn't have enough. But I stayed on Tammy's case for many, many years. I wanted justice for Tammy. I wanted justice for her mother and her kids. She deserved that." Though Schlabum was never charged, with Tamara's death, Deborah found some peace, knowing he would live out the rest of his days in prison. "He's not charged with Tammy's end, but he has to answer to one," she said, referencing a higher power. "He's got another one he's going to have to answer to, one much bigger." She closed with words of resignation and love. The family just have to rest now and know that she is at peace and that he will spend the little life he has left in prison, paying for what he's done.